You're listening to Malmborg Report, where we discuss the intersection of creativity, work, and the systems in which they are shaped. Welcome to the program. My guest today is an activist and a political candidate. His name is Dan Plaat. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, John.
Very good.
Always a little tense, but that's just because of the enormity of always what's in front of us when you seek to erode the system even.
Touche. I think that's the response.
My politics are not to be overly aggressive or confrontational. There's people that are always more angry than me. I mean, my anger is more of a seething, like I just hate everything, but I'm going to direct that hatred towards some productive project because I have the background, the privileges, the upbringing that, I'm not putting it towards other toxic or negative ways, or I know that I can direct it towards positive projects, even if there's a sense that like I could work at this for decades and decades and not feel like any progress has been made.
Well, yeah, I think anytime someone does something that's sort of a principled stand or an activism, there often is no guarantee of a particular outcome, especially if you're just one person doing your thing. But I know you've been involved for a very long time, well over a decade at this point. So bring me back, I don't know, let's say pre-Occupy. What were you doing pre-Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah, so just a general background. My father was a bit of an activist too, and then there were some of his older generation, line of Jews, immigrants to this country, some of them communists, some of them just peace activists in the 60s. My father was a conservationist first and foremost, so he helped found a nature preserve here in our area, the Albany Pine Bush, with a group of hippie activists that just a bunch of cleanups that then turned into suing the city or the municipality every time suburban sprawl was proposed to force them to do environmental reviews based on the Air and Water Act. And that eventually leads to creating, a preserve, or at least putting pressure on the city to make its own commission and whatnot. So that's just growing up in that leads me to believe that activism and sort of community organizing, at least, does have positive effects, and it creates these communities that I'm brought into as a child. So it's something I'm brought into, it's something I'm comfortable with, or it's what's normal to me even. But before Occupy, I was a new atheist, radicalizing in other ways throughout college, but that was the first kind of point because that was the cultural touchstone of 2006 and 7. The rejection of that kind of established. That was sort of something that was actually kind of safe. You couldn't yet say, I'm an anti-capitalist, unless you're some kind of anarchist. And that's still more in the marginal fringe, or it's just something that looks wacky to someone middle class. But from there, and being in the new atheist movement, I realized just how liberal it is and how it seems like the problem here is that the evangelicals are just super rich and they're able to buy, their money has influence in politics. That seems to be the problem here. Not just that they have the wrong ideas or they're anti-science. We can do all the science education we want. That doesn't change how unequal our society is.
Right.
It almost seemed like that didn't matter to these people.
Yeah, so it's like less of a theology issue, even if there are theological issues or, genuine skepticism of religious texts. It's more about, when you have a theocracy or sort of a strain of religious extremism within your country, which in the U.S. would certainly be the evangelical movement, I would say.
I consider it to be the problem, hierarchies and dogmatic thinking.
Yeah.
So when liberals started acting dogmatically about the system or about Iraq, that put me off. And then, so I was looking for something to do, especially since I was turned off of any kind of protest because we did a lot of that during the Iraq War and it didn't change anything. Protesting without a political vehicle is meaningless. It's like, I'm trying to come up with a better way of putting it since I'm anti-car, but it's like saying I'm going to drive somewhere, but I'm not going to do it using a car. Rather, that's my analogy to saying frick political parties or movements or other types of political vehicles. Like, we got to have a movement. I'm like, right, walking somewhere is a movement, but you need a vehicle, literally or figuratively. So I was radicalized, getting more anti capitalist, more socialist, certainly more anarchistic in my thinking, but not all the way there since, like, I know it's as its troubles. So, but an Occupy movement was a movement founded by anarchists, and it was them kind of doing their praxis in the best way possible. So when that sort of fizzled out, that's a signal that, like, the anarchist theories about movement politics just should be ignored, or they need to be heavily modified. The fact that they are repeated with Black Lives Matter kind of shows that lessons weren't really truly internalized, or they certainly weren't learned or propagated enough after the fact by the next generation, meaning Zoomers. But after keeping Occupy Albany in a holding pattern, I found myself into Green Party organizing because I wanted to find a political home. It didn't have to be a political party, but I saw a necessity in being involved in actual local politics, and that is what exists. And it's where the fight needs to be, because otherwise there's no opposition. And something that I thought was missing with Occupy was that we were not really fighting on terms that mattered. We were fighting on cultural terms. We were fighting on kind of individual terms, house by house, block by block, lot by lot. But there was nothing systemic about it. We're making a systemic critique, but then our actions were not systemic in any way. We were not building any real institutions. And any suggestion that we should was met with a lot of derision and pushback. And that's something where it's like, I just see that piece was missing. That's why electoral politics, in a iconoclastic way, not a reformist way, but a way that is truly independent of the system but still acting within it. That's what the Greens were to me. It was a measuring of pros and cons between the Green Party and other fusion parties. So I've kind of been doing Green Party stuff the most consistently since 2014, 15, but with community projects sprinkled in, because I can't quite decide on something called prefigurative politics, movement. I don't participate in movement politics, or party politics.
Right. So when you talk about needing a systemic counter, let's say in the form of a third party within our, I guess you would call it a two-party system, would you almost agree with the idea that when you devote and build up a third party, it's almost like planting a seed where over time, with nurturing and growth, it sprouts, and thus it becomes part of the ecosystem in which politics occurs?
The seed in the garden sort of analogy is used a lot since, it's Green Party. But I see it as making space and also taking a little bit of power so that movements can be represented.
Right.
So I think one way I would parse it, like a decade ago when I started, was movements need representation in government, or they need a vehicle to take power. And that's what political parties are, even if they're not electoral. They're means of taking power. You need to learn, like, there's a skill set to governing. And so many reject learning those skills, or thinking that it's for someone else to do. But then those someone else, a lot of unsung heroes of the quote unquote left. But yeah, we lack a left. And so what's kind of said by some observers is that we're all sort of spectators in our society. We don't have a say in our government and our state and our economy, because it's a capitalist government and a capitalist economy. We're really just spectators. And the only way we can have a say is if we build our own parallel government or in some ways, even an electoral party that wins power some places and villages and cities and places they can win, that builds our muscles for governing. A lot of activists can't even imagine having any power instead of creating a new one. That goes for any activist or movement person who runs as a Democrat. I consider the DSA to be like an entire organization devoted to that thinking. We're going to use the establishment power to transmorgify it. Even though a lot of DSAers, there's caucuses that are pretty radical in their thinking. And that's why they do more tenant organizing and other types of base building. It's interesting that there was this guy calling for base building in 2018, and there was a separate organization called the Marxist Center that made base building their entire project to get away from the other three tendencies where you're either doing just like protests, activism, militancy, just like the right kind of protest is the way forward. There's kind of like hobbyist kind of activism where, well, you do podcasts, you do education, you're laying the groundwork for others to do the work. And the third one, which is just entryist politics, government socialists. And base building is a way of trying to get away from that. But because the other three tendencies were already established and had their kind of grooves, and this includes the Green Party, base building instead sort of got absorbed by the other three tendencies. So the other three tendencies now kind of try to include base building thinking, which is base building is, by the way, just like unionizing, building co-ops, building an infrastructure, a base of members, of people who think along the same anti-capitalist lines, and eventually will be proud to say so and say it like fully. Even though a lot of consumer co-ops are much more of a big tent as far as the kind of people that just know that there's a really good of reasons to be in a co-op and to do co-ops, but they may not have any anti-capitalist leanings, actually.
It's just kind of a relatively or potentially narrow kind of consumer-based involvement.
Labor and community project. It's if it's going to have a leftist bent or an anti-establishment bent, then it has that has to be stated, or it never is, because then you will never get a grant and you'll never get any good donations, and you're basically stuck. But a piece of advice from who else but Sarah Silverman at a Radical podcast show in person. She gave some advice to like any other artist or creative that you can do whatever you want as long as you keep your overhead incredibly low.
There you go.
And I take that to heart whenever I'm thinking about what kind of budget one needs to get something done.
That's what I keep this show cheap as hell. That's kind of part of my thinking too, is that like it would take unless I become entirely insolvent and can't get electricity, I can still do what I'm doing. You know what I mean? And I think that's important. Like, obviously, there are times for expansion, but yeah, you want to be like low wattage.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this pull and tug between the desire to check out, to at least, or work to be as tethered to the capitalist economy as possible, untethered.
Yeah.
To work as little, to not have to spend any money, so you don't have to earn so much wages. Meanwhile, the political demand is for more wages, for more work, for more business development. There's different types of thinking about it being socialist, but unless it is worker control, don't call it socialist, because real worker control would be the ability to say, we're going to do a 4-day work week. And it actually means we're going to do more work.
Right.
But so that's the tug towards minimalism, and then the tug towards a maximalism, which is actually, we want a lot of things. The distribution of resources is 10 to 0.01. And even when an eco-socialist like me says the word degrowth, which conjures up certain Malthusian politics, it's actually the opposite. We're like, no, we're going to redistribute the means of production so that instead of all the wealth going to the 10 units of wealth, we're actually growing the amount everyone gets to 5. instead of that 0.01.
Creating
But
more material wealth on
yeah,
average. Yeah.
while using half as much
Right.
production, because quite frankly, we don't need so much.
Yeah. Something there that I see is, when people think about individual materialism, right? Like, oh, I buy too many cars, I buy too many fabrics or whatever, right?
Shirts.
Shirts, yeah. Like that can be a thing, but at scale, on the human scale, it's nothing compared to the corporate waste and mismanagement of resources on a
Yeah.
societal level, right?
So because these issues are so big and complicated, and the system's only getting larger and more complicated every time, even when it hits a crisis, it solves it by becoming more complicated and larger. Any political project I have is more geared towards eroding capitalism and its hold on our lives through a municipalist program, it's called, which is focused on local policy and things that can be done with a few $1 million instead of billions of dollars.
Right.
And it means gearing towards community ownership and doing things that don't outright feel like socialism, but is in fact putting control in the hands of the general population or civil society. Marx defined socialism as like the managing of things instead of people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about how all of our laws, for the most part, are managing people and their actions and not land and how we do, but it's like that's what makes land use policy more socialist than not, is that it's geared towards managing things like land and food rather than the behaviors of people taking food or loitering, just to
Yeah.
give a very basic example.
Sure.
Using space.
So tell me about your electoral efforts in this particular cycle. You're running for city council in Albany.
Yes. So I've been an on again, off again candidate, but usually as a ballot filler or the goal was outreach. The last time I did, it was 8 years ago, a very different place in my life. And I've spent the last 8 years, well, I shifted to community media, doing my own podcasting,
That's right.
but also doing so in a community context so that I was growing some local capacity for sharing information. And if I dreamed, it was a dream to actually create local news, because otherwise the source of news is the Hearst newspaper and some basic cable TV stations that only do 5 minutes of material every night, a worthy material, and nothing that's super local, of course. Nothing about what's going on in your block or the minutia. There's a lot of barriers to that being effective means of spreading information.
And it's limited. One person tells one person, the next person tells another person. At a certain point, that weakens, and it kind of just stays contained. Yeah.
Especially as we're sorted more towards in our interests and professions and not by geography. Something that I've encountered in the last few years is it's so much harder to organize people because we're not staying in one spot for very long. People would change. First, it was location, and at least especially in apartments, young professionals or young workers having to move around. Then it becomes maybe not our emails, but our phones, changing our phones all the time, what phone plan we're using, or the phones suck, so they break often. So it's like, oh, here's my new number. Here's my new number. Imagine trying to maintain a call list. People's numbers change every year. Now, because of the disruptions on the internet, people are changing their social media accounts, like what social media platform they're using. If half of your network switches to Blue Sky, but the other half doesn't, then you need to start posting on two platforms if you're going to maintain at least an audience.
Yeah.
But something like, I just went through a visual novel whose theme was, or at least one theme I took from it, was that being internet famous or being a political leader on the internet is not the same as actually having real power.
I would agree.
Or being a celebrity. As Trump can attest to, he doesn't actually have real power. No one in the world gives a to do what he wants, even with the U.S. military. It's just he doesn't actually have the power. That's why I sort of scoff when people say he's a power-hungry dictator, and it's not a fact.
He's a ratings-hungry cosplayer of a dictator, you might say.
He plays a fascist on TV. So yes, but you did ask me about my campaign.
Well, yeah.
I was just giving the background. Because of an open seat here in the ward, I'm finally running to win here in my local ward.
What's the number again?
It's the third.
Third ward, okay.
Out of 15. We're pretty large. Our county legislature is also fairly large for such bodies. There's 30 seats in the county legislature. It's fairly large, and obviously conservatives love complaining about it because each of those people do get a small salary. It's nothing compared to other kinds of expenses, though. It's basically a rep for every 6,000 people. And 15 is a good size. This is one of the more blighted neighborhoods. It's sort of in between the more general hood and the more dense, bougie part of town and the downtown and uptown areas. Right. So it doesn't really have any large landmarks or institutions, just a smattering of small churches that only have 10 congregants at a time, all aging. Maybe a pseudo community center and some kind of blight fighting offices. It's slowly filling in with nonprofit, and on Clinton Avenue, one of the main streets, which is mostly residential, but it does have some businesses and could have a lot more if it actually served as a neighborhood corridor. But it's getting some new life through a consortium of real estate people who came from the hood. So they want to do right by tenants, but they are still running a business. So there's a contradiction there to be discussed with them at length at another time. There's sort of a conflict of I sort of want to make it before I start having those serious conversations, though usually you win by having these serious conversations and building support.
What are you hearing on the ground? So obviously you're doing petitions, you're getting signatures. What are constituents talking about?
So because of the way the petitioning works, it made sense to only door knock those not registered Democrat.
Okay.
Which is still a third of those registered, but most of them have not voted ever. And so I was sort of worried, actually, because when people register no party, it usually means they don't want to engage at all whatsoever. But that's not always the case. It just means that they're not expecting to be engaged, or they just don't because we're a one-party city-state dominated by the Democrats, and they have for over a century, since 1919. And so what I'm hearing is, it's always a bell curve of reactions. So those threes are simply a nice that you're doing this, good luck, not really expressing anything. No one's ever asked me what I'm passionate about or what I care about. So sometimes it's just a general shrug and things suck and they could be better, but I don't know how they could be better. And that's where my platform comes in. And if they're curious, I explain more of it, or I just lead with something I know people will like, which is the municipal internet, something that my city has studied already, and we could make a full plan, but it's just sitting around and there doesn't seem to be a political will to work on it or to bring it forward. I don't know why, but a lot of council people seem to have their own interests, but there's also a restriction they have on them to basically nibble at the edges, update the language of ordinances, not really do anything big.
Well, I have a bit of a pun here. It could be something to do with where some people are on the political spectrum. There's an internet service provider joke in there.
Oh, yes. And they're
not a
monopoly.
great one, but yeah.
So let me get to the actual reactions I'm getting. Some are absolutely positive. Oh, yeah, you're not stick it to those Dems. Some are just a little hungry that there is something else in the pipeline. And again, it's because I'm talking to non-Dems. Sometimes I'm encountering things that are pretty sad.
Yeah.
There was one person on the list who was younger, so I'm I really do want to interact with people under 30. In fact, there was one signature I got from someone whose father was pretty scruffy looking, and He didn't know she was registered.
Yeah.
And he also thought she wasn't old enough to be registered. But according to the date of birth, she was 20. So
Interesting.
so she comes out and he's like, you didn't tell me you registered.
Lack
I
of
wonder
communication and coordination.
But the sad one was he had died at age 22. And the mother answered the door and talked to me. And most people are polite. So people who are afraid to talk to their neighbors or to go door knocking, usually the block is like you need to have something to talk about.
Right.
Not just say, well, I just want to introduce myself and get to know you. That's sort of awkward. And like, well, why? Just to get to know me? Why? What's everyone must have a motive.
So having a political context for being there gives you some cover because that's a reason.
Yeah, I'm just speaking psychically, though.
Right.
I think there shouldn't be such barriers to talking to one's neighbors.
I think people are so protective over their domicile, right? Where it's like, like if you're not here for a very specific reason, unless you're the post office, why are you here?
Everyone's just doing a job. And
Yeah.
and that sort of goes into the spiral poverty that occurs on the individual level, but it also occurs on the city and societal level when there is a spiral of lack of trust, fuels
Yeah.
more competition, which fuels more exploitation, which fuels more distrust.
Yeah.
Which fuels more inequality, which fuels more distrust.
Right.
In fact, some political scientists back in the 60s and 70s called it the Albany syndrome, because we've been ruled by oligarchs since 1600, even though most of the population has completely changed since then. But the governing structure, being very mayor-focused, hasn't. And that's what's interesting about our current race for mayor this year, is that there really aren't any strong candidates, except for this newcomer who's like a capitalist, but he's coming off as the more competent one.
Right.
It's a bind for someone like me, but it's interesting in that way.
Well, have you had the chance to engage with them, or do you have any intention to debate them? Are they in a different
not for
ward?
mayor.
Different ward? Oh, you're talking
No,
about the mayoral. Sorry,
I'm talking about the larger
Yeah.
context, which
Gotcha.
most people are still just really disengaged from. There's a certain number of levels of goals here
Right.
to do politics, and something that 80% of politics is just making friends.
Yeah.
And political power just means having more friends than the other guy. Trump has more fans. Sometimes fans look like friends. They're not really, but they're sort of parasocial friends.
Right.
When politics is spectacle, more spectacle than substance, fans is enough. But when it comes to local politics, it is definitely you need actual friends and actual trust in people, which is very, very difficult in these times of inequality and subversion and competition.
Yeah.
It's hard to know who to trust, especially in even tight-knit communities where enough toxic moves or personality conflicts means that some people can't be friends. And it's that like, well, I don't want the pressure of having to make 1,000 friends in order to have a political base. But that's sort of what it is. They're not like the strongest, best friends that you have to get along with, but like you have to build trust with people.
Yes.
And so there becomes a sort of order of operations in you have to earn trust by doing things and favors and showing that you put in the work and that you are doing something for them. It is hard to do this, though, if you don't have some kind of political base or resources or power already. That's sort of why the usual path is a form of entryism, to be an intern for the establishment and then eventually get hired in the business, the corporation that is the Democratic Party. To do it on your own, it's like being a startup, but without any venture capitalists funding.
Either one, right?
It's like you have to crowdfund, but instead of for your health care, it's to do your politics. And your politics, again, you have to lose, but then you win. And the wins can matter because they can inspire more kinds of wins, or at least create the space for wins and the space for trusting each other. And there are movements or entities in my city that kind of allow for this, but they're not well known. They're not widespread. They're little islands. Nonprofits, which then union bust. And then there's always limitations to whatever kind of vehicle you use. And that includes the electoral one because of well-known conclusions about the two-party system and, well, you can't really win until we do election reform. Well, how do you do election reform, Dumbo? You go to march for it unless there's actual consequences, like the protest does turn into a strike or it does turn into a blockade of sorts. It applies real economic pressure that outpaces that of capital or the local small business community. And perhaps in economic downturns, these capitalist communities get weaker, and this creates opportunities for socialists. But we need to be able to, well, take those opportunities, and that means having our shit together. And that's sort of what's turned me off of just doing mutual aid. It's good that we have it, but it's not base building. You're kind of making friends, but at the same time, seeing it being done year in, year out, and being part of Food Not Bombs, you're making friends with the people you're doing it with. But then when I asked those people to do another type of political project or maybe even fight for some power, they all couldn't be bothered. Or they're not too enthusiastic about it because they've been burned, or they just don't think there's any point. There's not enough of us. And that's where it is a matter of finding more friends and just doing mutual aid in a tight-knit community, or even if you help hundreds of people, you're not building a deep relationship with people you're helping, even if it's mutual aid. A lot of it is still an informal relationship. It's not a deep relationship where someone even remembers your name.
Right. So those works, even if they have value materially for what they are, they're not analogous to base building power in a political context.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out myself, actually. I want it to be more formalized. When the city does a big clothing swap, that can help 1,000 people versus the dozens that come by the monthly free store.
Yeah.
The establishment of a permanent free store for the buy nothing groups that swap things on Facebook, but it's all very kind of inefficient. It really helps if you have a car, if you can pick things up, and something more formal, something more like organized. There's sort of beauty in things being decentralized, but that's not really the society we live in. We live in a big, organized, centralized society. And I suppose there's the push towards trying to leave it behind and try to work outside of it. But I'm not really seeing that happening in the people who kind of hold those attitudes. If you want to tune out and live outside of capitalism, then what are you doing in a city? You need to be on the country homesteading. But some of the people who need the most help are disabled, and they need to be around as many people as possible for assistance, for community. So back to the campaign, though. I run as Green Party. I'm petitioning now. There's no particular strategy except knowing ahead of time that most people in my city don't win their city council office until the second time they run.
Right.
I expect that this will be more towards finding the first 100 supporters, and then the next time I'll double or triple that.
There you go.
Because it takes a full year just to cover a neighborhood. But there were some Greens in the UK that basically said, like, we took half of a city council because we just spent a year lit dropping a district, and then a year later we could win in that district, and then the next year or two we won in multiple districts. And so my messaging is like, one Green on the council can shift everybody towards us, right? Towards action, not pussyfooting around. If we do get half a loaf, then we make sure we bake the other half of the loaf. Really, one of the mayoral candidates started the public access TV station, but then he totally just left it to fester, and basically it's a total failure. There's like 4 people making TV programs, and nobody knows about it because it was never properly funded. It was only given 15 grand a year. I moved to the community radio, which was getting set up. And so I was involved with that for 5 years. And the last 2 years of it, I was running it. But I wasn't allowed to touch any money, so I couldn't really lead underwriting efforts. And so we were basically broke. And we had set up a partnership with Pacifica, which cost something, and other types of infrastructure that cost something, a few $1,000s a year. It's nothing extravagant. A few good underwriters could cover it. But the leadership wasn't there and it didn't really care. Because they, as in their words, it's a youth arts center and there were no kids programs. There was no kids making radio content. It was kind of ironic that it was set up and, well, anyway, there was just no consistent management of it. The fact that I was managing it just to keep it on was triage.
Yeah.
So I'm not particularly proud, but I will mention it because it was me running something and I was training people, and it feels good doing that work. What didn't feel good was working in these nonprofits that are just run by schmoes or opportunists. And it's definitely not anti-capitalist, and it's not changing the game. It's not opening new possibilities. It's actually the same old possibilities.
Before we go, give me your assessment of the Albany races coming up. What do you think is going to happen, and where do you see the city going? Do you see it just going in the same loop?
Not quite. One thing that's coming in is that there are some crises like the dump or trash issue that needs to be resolved. There's also a lot of money that will be coming into the city, whether it's via the state, 400 million that the governor wants to pump into downtown one way or the other, though half of it will go to the state museum and renovate it, which I have mixed feelings on because I feel like that renovation will make it half of it being a gift shop and commercialize the museum more, or more like electronic displays and fancy things, make it like a Boston Science Museum or something. It's just like people do enjoy the exhibits if they're minimalist too, you know. They're classic. But otherwise, in the last cycle or two, the makeup of the council has been way more fluid. Like it changes more often. I think it's a mix of like people moving on more. Like the machine isn't really what it was. It's definitely changed in its makeup and how it works. There's more openings for new blood, though there's still a lot of ass kissing happening. Or you just have to play by the rules and don't shake the boat too often. But the fact that most of the council, it used to be way more like impossible to think that we would ever pursue rent control. But that majority of the council was pursuing it. And now they're hitting a wall with that because we need to do a study to prove that we need to do rent control with a vacancy study. But the way it was handled, and this is also because the mayor didn't want it to happen, it was shown that we don't have a high enough vacancy rate for the state to give us permission to have rent regulations because rents are not too damn high, apparently.
Right.
They're only
They're pretty high
if there's no vacancies.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. There have to be enough vacancies, right, to show that, look, no one can afford any of this.
Yeah.
But because there are still tech workers that can afford $2,000 rents,
It's giving bad data. Yeah. Like,
yeah.
no, for
I'm
sure.
like, what standards? And so that there's a lot of bullshit to contend with.
All right. What's your at? Like, where can people find you at? What's your website, your social media? What do you got going on?
So the website is plaatforalbany.com.
Okay.
Plaatforalbany.com. I'm on TikTok at my name, Dan Plaat, Plaat. The Facebook page, which I post to sometimes, is Dan Plaat for Third Ward. So otherwise, happy May Day, which is Thursday.
Yes.
Workers' Day. The agenda is public works and jobs, reducing waste and costs through breaking monopolies, but also reducing our waste as far as our household waste, but also just the trash that comes in, and democratic reforms like in elections, like participatory budgeting, proportional representation, all of policies and ideologies. Otherwise, it all goes towards eroding capitalism and its hold on our lives, opening up the possibilities, communicating those possibilities to the general public in ways that other lefties talk about online over and over and over again. When are they actually doing it? What does it ever come to?
Dan the doer, and I appreciate that. Well, thank you for coming on, and we will chat again in the very near future.
I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks for listening to Malmborg Report. If you enjoyed this episode, follow me on social media at It's John Malmborg and subscribe to Malmborg Report on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Want to stay in the loop? Sign up for my email list at johnmalmborg.com. And if you'd like to support the show directly, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Malmborg Report. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.